The Bite Size Answers section of the Therefore Project website is designed to give simple answers to complex questions in order to get to the gospel. Because as we've said so many times, it's the gospel and not our answers that is the power of God to salvation. But the truth is that it's been my experience, and I'm sure it's been yours too, that every conversation doesn't lead to an opportunity to communicate the gospel. And even if it does, people may not be ready to cross that line of faith and begin following Jesus, which is very understandable because coming into a relationship with Jesus is a process, kind of like the ripening of fruit. Every person is somewhere on their spiritual journey. Everybody is somewhere in that ripening process. You are, I am, and so is every single person we meet. So I want us to think about that process and just what it looks like. I've drawn something here that, although it's pretty primitive, like most of the things that I draw, I think it'll help you visualize what we're talking about when we talk about process. Every person is somewhere on this spectrum in their relationship with God. Right here at the top is a cross. That just represents where somebody comes into a relationship with God through the cross of Jesus Christ. The blue over here represents those who have not yet crossed that line of faith, and the red on this side is those that have. Now, on this blue side, although none of them have yet come into a relationship with Christ, they're not all at the same place. Some may be very, very far away, like represented down here by a -10. Maybe they've never even heard of Jesus. Maybe there's some that have heard, but they're still confused. So they're maybe like at a 7. Maybe there's some that have moved past that and now they're beginning to investigate. Like maybe they're at a 5 or a 3. And then maybe there's some that are so ripe, I just call them a -1, who are ready to fall off the branch. How we deal with each of these at these different stages is different as God is drawing them because they're not all the same. That's what we mean by it's a process. Inviting to someone to join you at your church when you're at a -10, they're probably not going to do it, but they just might if they're here at a 3 or if they're here at a 1. Now, by the way, it's the same thing over here on the red side. These are the people like at a +1 who maybe have just come to faith. They hardly know anything, but they continue to grow. Maybe to a +3, they're growing in their understanding. More transformation is taking place. And we know that in churches, we don't treat all these people the same because spiritual growth is a process. But let's talk about those who are in the blue over here, who have not yet crossed that line of faith. In a court of law, there are two very critical parts in the trial process. The first is testimony. People coming forward and giving firsthand accounts of things that they've seen or things that they've heard or things that they've experienced. The second part is evidence. It's tangible things that can be seen that give credibility to that testimony. Testimony says, I saw person A stab person B. Evidence is, here is the knife with person A's fingerprints all over it. The process of somebody coming to faith in Christ involves both testimony and evidence. The testimony is actually the presentation of the gospel, which is one of the things we teach here at Therefore Project. The evidence is actually seeing the reality of God in the life of someone who's a follower of Jesus, and both are very critical in this process. The hypocrisy of Christianity has really challenged the credibility of Jesus and of his message. Christians saying one thing and then doing another. The increased number of sexual and financial and power scandals among church leadership is now broadcast all over social media. There's always been opposition and resistance to Jesus and to Christianity, but technology has now made it so accessible that it gets blasted everywhere and has become a very common theme. 50 years ago, the Bible and the church was somewhat respected in the culture, but today it's been replaced by science, by political correctness, and just simply by the expression of personal freedoms. We live in a time when people need more than testimony. They're looking for some hard evidence of the credibility of the reality of God. And you and I, as followers of Jesus, are that hard evidence. This means we have to live our lives in relationship with those who don't know God. For some, this might cause kind of a tension because you may have been raised to think that the idea of true spirituality is to distance yourself from those people are the sinners because, after all, they're the bad people. And can I just say that if that's true of you, you need to change because our leader, Jesus, was known as being a friend of sinners, a badge that he wore with honor. Our video, Living Salty, talks about this, and I encourage you to watch this to get a better idea of what this looks like and feels like. So if you've ever had the opportunity to communicate the gospel with someone who's in your orbit, don't just end it there. Find ways to continue to engage with them as God is drawing them and moving them from a -7 to a -5 to a -1 as they see evidence of the reality of God in your life. Let me mention one more aspect of how this process works. The Apostle Paul and a guy by the name of Apollos were both very instrumental in seeing people come to Christ in the city of Corinth in Greece, and a church was started. Now, before long, people started to say, "Oh, I'm a follower of Paul because he led me to Christ." And others were saying, "Oh, no, I'm a follower of Apollos." And it got very, very divisive. So the Apostle Paul wrote a letter. And he wanted this. He wrote the letter to deal with some issues, and this was one of the issues. And I want to read what he says about this issue in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. And I'm going to start reading in verse 5. He says, "Who then is Apollos? And who then is Paul? Servants through whom you believed," notice this phrase, "even as the Lord gave opportunity to each one." We've talked about this before. God opens up opportunities at different times. We just need to be sensitive to what he's doing. But then listen to verse 6. Paul's talking and he said, "I planted, Apollos watered, but God was causing the growth." What the Apostle Paul is saying here is that God uses lots of people in the process of somebody coming to faith in Christ. It's kind of like wheat. Somebody plants that seed and then somebody comes along and waters it, or the rain waters it, then there's sunshine, somebody maybe fertilizes it, and then there's harvesting. So what he's saying is be ready to be used by God in any part of this process. But don't ever say, please get me on this. Don't ever say, "Well, I just have the gift of being a planter. I'm just a waterer." Don't think of yourself as a specialist, but kind of as a utility player, being ready to be used by God at just any place in this process. Therefore, Project is designed to help you learn how to do this, to be able to function in all these different aspects as God is drawing people to himself. So step up every day to be used by God anywhere he chooses in this process as he's drawing people to himself. Don't stop short of communicating the message of the gospel if God gives the opportunity, because never forget, it's the gospel alone that's the power of God to salvation. So begin asking God to give you the opportunity to be a harvester. Because if you experience this, it'll not only change another person's eternity, their life and their eternity, but I guarantee you, it'll change you.